keep writing and I will check. Student who struggles. Oh, okay, great. Hi, Veronica and Alex. Perfect. Which fishbowl activity do you mean? The one that's on our resource list? In the top of our Moodle page, or is there a different one you're talking about? Oh, yeah, exactly. That's right. So I am perfect. Hi, hi. It's so fun over there. You guys are having a really good time. Woo! Just kidding. Um, See if we can get a couple other ideas out here. I'll give us about 5 minutes and then we'll talk. And if it's a small group, then it will be. And if it's larger, we will include them too. Hi, Lori. So let's take 5 minutes. We'll start at like 7 after. See if you can get some thoughts down. So, and Kate, you too, or your group, whoever wrote that, Veronica, Alex, and Kate. If you're thinking about that fishbowl activity from the math video, one of that second question I have here about strategies or structures to help. So let's think about it. Like what might it look like if a kid is struggling with social cognition, attempting to engage in a math discussion in a fishbowl format? And do you have any thoughts on how you might support somebody who needs that kind of additional scaffold? Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kate. We'll take about 2 or 3 more minutes. Let's see if anyone else has an idea they could share. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm curious. Great, thanks, Lori. I was thinking about how a deficit in social cognition can lead to difficulties with pragmatics, conflict resolution, even making it difficult with think, pair, share strategies. Yeah, it can, Lori. Exactly. That's why these kind of structures and strategies and tools to support kids in being able to participate in those kinds of learning activities that place high demands on social cognition is especially important. Exactly. So I'm curious in particular about Veronica and Alexandra's ideas because maybe one of you would be willing first to pop on the phone and share, like, I'm curious what you learned, Alexandra, this week that you discovered about the think time before working with a group, because that, in my experience, can make quite a big difference for some kids. Are you able or willing to share a little bit about that with us? If so, just pop on the phone. Good, go ahead. Do you have a phone?
Can you hear me?
I can. Can everyone else?
Sorry. It came onto everyone else's computer.
Good.
Okay. So what I thought, I don't know, I saw this in someone's discussion post this week about, like, letting them, have their own kind of, like, private work time before meeting with the group so they could come to the group prepared.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was really interesting how it kind of mirrors, like, real life. Like when you are working on a committee or something like that,
yes.
You obviously need to prepare your work before you show up to your meeting. And I don't know, yes. I like that. That's a good kind of like real life training.
That's really helpful too, and I appreciate that you raised that. I hadn't thought as that connection to what it's like in like real life, like grown-up life, is a really powerful one too, because the anxiety that it can call up for a person like me, if I were to show up to a meeting and not know what I was talking about, or if I was asked to engage in a very public discussion on a topic I did not feel like I knew a lot about or kind of even had a basic understanding of, that would provoke a fair amount of social anxiety for me, a person who's typically, like, I'm fairly comfortable in social situations. I don't think of myself as someone who embarrasses that easily, but that would actually be difficult. So now if we start to think about that in terms of a child who has social difficulties anyway and doesn't feel fully prepared to engage in a discussion, it could potentially be really debilitating in terms of their capacity to participate in the discussion. So that is really helpful. And so I think some of that, having this idea of just being able to separate the components of the task to support kids, that's one of the things I really like about the neurodevelopmental framework, is it lets us unpack the demands of tasks into those neurodevelopmental construct dimensions. So something like having a group task, if there's a compounding effect of needing support with doing preparing the work itself, and the social component is taken into account, doing a little bit of background preparation to give kids a chance to at least feel confident in one, if not both of those areas, can make a really big difference, right? So one way to approach that is to give the kids time and maybe direction and support for preparing to engage in the discussion. Another way, it kind of piggybacks on some of what Kate is talking about in both of her posts, this kind of one at 6:04 near the top, and also at 6:06, which really starts to think about not the content of what they're talking about necessarily, but the feelings that kids are having socially and their skills in social participation. So again, that unpacking and kind of teasing out these multiple layers and dimensions of demands embedded in a task that might look simple to a teacher who doesn't kind of think it through from the lens of student participation and the construct. if you start to turn your attention to that, then you see, oh, there's like heavy demands on social cognition, and there's heavy demands on language, and there's heavy content area demands that may include memory or higher order thinking. And so by helping kids build up their ability to participate through targeted tasks like practice observing others participating in groups, watching what they're saying, and maybe having a kind of quick debrief about the participation itself can make a big difference for kids that are struggling with social cognition. Giving kids time to work on their content that they want to talk about can support kids. It'll have a social impact. It can also potentially support kids who are struggling with language, expressive language in some way, or with memory, or with higher order thinking. So that kind of preparation embeds supports for social cognition and other construct areas. And having some of that individual time also, as we talked about last week, can be almost like a respite for kids who are barraged with social interactions throughout the day, but for whom that is difficult or kind of cumbersome. Nice thinking. Lori's saying that she's thinking about how a deficit in social cognition can lead to difficulties with pragmatics, conflict resolution skills, and even make it difficult during Think, Pair, Share. Yes, it can. I'm guessing I'm not the only one who's encountered kids in the classroom who seemingly start arguments in groups, or in Think, Pair, Share. There's or if there's ask kids to select a topic they're going to work on or do some kind of partner work, and then there'll be that kid or a couple kids who just cannot handle those interactions without arguing with their peers and partners. Quite often, that is an indication of a difficulty with social cognition. So one way to interpret that behavior is that person's being difficult. Another way to interpret the behavior is the kid is just obstinate, right? An alternative way that I find more productive personally is to start to hone in on okay, well, if that child is consistently unable to have positive and pro-social interactions in pairs and in small groups, then there's likely some kind of weakness or challenge in the area of social cognition, or there's something blocking that student's ability to engage in positive social interactions. So I start to look at where I could provide additional supports. And sometimes those supports will look like sentence frames for participation. Sometimes those supports will look like featuring model partnerships and doing kind of a mini lesson around what partner work looks like in a very direct way, which is similar in some ways to those social skills curricula. But as we also talked about last week, the dots being connected between social skills curricula for how to interact on the playground versus how to interact in small group and partner work, that cognitive bridge is something kids often need support with. And so I find that embedding right in the directions for Think, Pair, Share, what Think, Pair, Share should look like to be a positive learning experience for everyone can be really helpful, really for all kids. I tend to anchor my thinking around the kids that are struggling socially, but I have found that there is tremendous benefit, even for kids who can kind of get away with their version of Think, Pair, Share. They can enrich their contributions by putting a little bit of attention to that. Hopefully that makes sense to people. Let me just see if we... Oh, and Veronica, would you be willing to share what connections you're talking about restorative justice, which is a topic that I have a lot of interest in, but don't have a lot of experience in using as a classroom teacher. So I'm curious, what connections did you see to what Kate was talking about, acknowledge the feelings in language? Do you want to pop on the phone? Are you willing to do that? If not, you can write. Maybe Veronica stepped away. Oh, that's totally fine. You are welcome to do that, Veronica. It's completely fine. Is there anyone else who has knowledge about restorative justice that would like to share something about the connections to what we're talking about in terms of social cognition? Because I would love to learn, to be honest. And anyone else is welcome to write or to pop on the phone. Well, we'll wait. I'll wait, Veronica. I'm guessing you're typing now. Oh, hi.
Hi.
Who's this?
Hi, it's Mindy. Sorry, for some reason the ID wasn't the link wasn't working, but I'm here.
Hi, Mindy. How are you? Are you just on the phone or are you on the computer also?
I'm on the computer.
Great. Perfect. Do you know much about restorative justice? Because I see Veronica's idea, but I would like to learn helping students with conflict resolution. Sure. Okay. Got it. So Veronica's saying that she has been reenacting situations with kids and talking about how students could have behaved or reacted differently. I feel like that's my understanding. Yeah.
RJ talked about like what was the harm done to different parties. We had like circles to like restore, basically like repair if there was some harm done. So think more about people than consequences.
Got it. Oh, that's an interesting angle. Okay. Oh, so it's restorative justice for the individual. It's like thinking about and kind of moving on beyond a conflict and resolving it in a way such that like all parties are made whole again. Okay. Oh, that's cool. Okay, so I think that should actually have really interesting connections. I'm guessing partly because it's Tuesday and I moved the date. Thanks again. And just because I can see, I'm guessing most people have not yet read the Social Autopsy reading that is coming out of Rick Lavoie's work, which he's the Fat City person. Yes, Veronica's saying it's reminding you of what Kate said because they can analyze their behavior a bit and recognize how they can act differently. Exactly. And that is what the social autopsy protocol is intended to accomplish as well. So Rick Lavoie's work around social autopsy, I believe, predates restorative justice as like a kind of approach to discipline in schools. And it takes on this idea of, it's essentially the kind of big nugget of the idea is that when there's a social breakdown, the place to start, what I like about Rick Lavoie's approach is that we start with interpreting a social breakdown as a breakdown in social interaction as opposed to just a kind of rule-breaking violation of norms. You look at it as like a kind of loss of what the rules are or the ways that we participate in positive ways, and you autopsy the event. What happened? What did someone say? How did that make you feel? How did you respond? This very like kind of close analysis, like Veronica's talking about, like Kate was mentioning with restorative justice, like Mindy was just saying, is you go back into the interaction and kind of unpack where it broke down and what happened. And then I don't know the extent to which this will overlap with restorative justice and where it departs. But the autopsy starts to look at what we could do differently next time. And then there's kind of like a revisit later of, did we try these new strategies and how did it go? So I suggest your assignment for this week is to do a reading response to, it's not a long reading, it's online, but it would be the equivalent of like a 2-page reading on social autopsies. If you see connections between social autopsies and any of the social skills, curricula, or approaches, or restorative justice that you use, I encourage you to draw those connections in your reflection because I have a feeling that the goals are very similar and the strategies are likely have a lot of crossover as well. So why not kind of file them similarly in your thinking? Great. And those kinds of direct and explicit confrontations of social breakdowns are, in my experience, again, helpful for a lot of kids and really critical for kids that are struggling with social cognition, right? So, I'm not picking that up. Sorry about that. I have another call coming in. This idea, sorry, I lost my train of thought, and I was reading something about analyzing the way people could interact differently. Anyway, just do that. Oh, I was saying it's crucial or critical for the kids that have social struggles and difficulties. So this idea of how kids take up verbal pragmatics and how they code switch between the yard, the lunch area, small group work, whole class academic discussions, socializing after school in after school activities and at home. That code switching that kids are required to kind of engage in over the course of the school day is assumed something people pick up on. And it's highly frustrating for kids that have difficulty reading the signals that are often subtle. And so, especially for kids that have any diagnoses that fall along the autistic spectrum disorders, there are typically social challenges included and involved. And then also for kids with language-based learning disabilities, often there's a kind of receptive language difficulty that can cross over a lot with socializing. For those kids, giving some kind of like intentional attention to the social components of tasks can make just an enormous difference in how they're able to participate in the classroom. So I just highly recommend that you take a close look at your kids in terms of their social participation, which I can see some people have already been doing, and kind of thinking about, like Alexandra's talking about her discovery this week, right? Like, just let it bubble up as you observe the social components that are invisible. They're not invisible, but they're not addressed directly often in typical classroom routines and tasks. In my experience, the kind of ideas for where kids need support make themselves very visible just by looking closely at where kids are struggling. So that would be my suggestion to you. Does anyone else have comments or questions about that idea of locating where these demands are embedded, or how we might address them, before I show you a couple things? Okay. Right, if you do, just jump in. Okay, so I have a couple things I wanted to show you this week, and there are slides up on our Moodle page. I did not post my own lecture for you this week because I kind of wanted to show you these slides while we're together, so I'm going to go through them in a minute. I do highly recommend, if you haven't yet watched it, Craig Pullman's video that connects neuromotor function and social cognition is very useful, especially for our ongoing assignment. We have the part 2 is due this week, where you're going to take the same student that you thought about in terms of neuromotor function and think about that person's social cognition. So Craig Pullman's video is nice because he kind of connects the constructs also when he's talking, and that'll give you a chance to hopefully kind of get started in thinking about your own kid that way. Oh, really? One second. Really? Sorry, 1 minute.
By the pound or hash sign. Enter your participant ID followed by. You are in the Zoom meeting now. There are over 10 participants in the meeting.
Okay, can you hear me now? Great. Sorry about that. That was so strange. Okay. I think I got another call that I didn't answer, but I think it like cut me off. Sorry about that. So, do you have to leave and rejoin to get audio? I don't think so, Tracy. Tracy, you can hear me now. Okay, good. I don't know where we got cut off. We heard thank you. Thanks, Mindy. Want to connect Pullman. Right. So, Craig Pullman's video for this week connects social cognition to neuromotor function, and that is very similar to what your assignment that's due the part 2 of your student focus for this kind of threaded assignment in these 6 weeks. That's very similar to what you're being asked to do in terms of looking at it through the lens of a kid. But think about the person you described their neuromotor function. Now we're asking you to kind of update your description of that person using social cognition as a lens. And so I suggest that you watch Craig Pullman's video first so that you kind of can have in your mind the connections between the constructs as he's talking about them, and then it might give you some insights into the person that you're thinking about and looking at really closely. I just rewatched Pullman's video today, and he had some really interesting examples of the social demands embedded in sports and the ways sports can support social cognition, but also the way that kids that struggle with social cognition might struggle with sports. So I just found it useful, and I hope you do too. So that's one thing I wanted to tell you. The other thing is I want to show you the slides that are posted for this week and just talk with you about them in live time because I think that would be a good use of us getting ideas out a little bit for the kinds of scaffolds and supports that help kids. In this neurodevelopmental framework and the original kind of iteration of the work, the construct of social cognition was addressed in terms of the important dimensions, but the strategies for supporting kids have developed outside of this work, I think, in really interesting ways, including curricula such as restorative justice, including these kind of social skills curricula that we see in classrooms. And so for this construct in particular, I found it really useful to think collectively about what people already know about supporting social interactions in the classroom, because it's as valuable as what we might find if I gave you a lot to kind of read in terms of resources. So I thought I would just share that with you. Really? Anyone else lost me? Let's see. James, I don't know what no means. You did not lose me. That means you hear me. Okay. Mindy, I don't know. Hopefully this is, oh, perfect, thank you. Hopefully this is still recording. All right, good. Bridget, thank you. Yeah, Mindy, maybe you should just call in. On your phone, I don't know what device you're using. I'm gonna present these slides, and while I'm doing that, Mindy, if you need help, just chat out, okay? Hopefully that'll be. So, let's go through these, and I'm going to request that anyone kind of stops me if and when you have questions or comments to make about the slides so that we can get your kind of ideas addressed. Okay, so this is week 5. I can't believe how fast it's gone. And this week we're talking specifically, and we want to think specifically about what teachers can do to support social cognition. So as I said, one of the assignments for this week is to reflect on, respond to Rick Lavoie's social autopsy, and that is an intentional strategy that is designed specifically to help teachers support social cognition. So that's kind of one input from us in terms of what you can do. But there's going to be a lot of overlap with things you already know. So I please encourage you to draw those connections for yourself. Okay, so here are the objectives. We're going to apply the knowledge and vocabulary related to social thinking through identification of an individual and class-wide strategies that use strengths and affinities to leverage challenges. So that'll happen largely through your thinking about your student that you've already focused on for neuromotor function. We're also going to think about strategies, and we're going to put social thinking in the context of other constructs, just like we've already been doing so far in this call. All right. So there's this really straightforward slide here that this is this idea of social cognition, and it's just thinking about relating, right? These 2 dimensions I find are very useful to think about in terms of unpacking the hidden social demands in classroom tasks and figuring out where those social breakdowns are occurring. So I find these distinctions really useful. There's verbal pragmatics, and this is in the book as well. And that's just using language in social contexts. And then there's these nonverbal pragmatics, these behaviors and nonverbal tactics that foster optimal relationships with others. So I think it might be useful if we take a couple minutes and just see if we can brainstorm a few examples of what we think nonverbal pragmatics means. Some of these are available in the book. Some of these you could do hopefully off the top of your head as people that work with kids. What are examples of the kinds of behaviors and nonverbal tactics that kids use to develop relationships with others? Right. So there's reading. So kids need to be able to read facial expressions, body language. That's right, Kate. What kind of body language is going to kind of support a positive relationship with others? So in terms of facial expressions, I'm going to just throw out there like, yeah, so closer proximity, but not too close, right? Thank you, Lori. So facing forward, eye contact. These are expectations that people hold in the classroom, and some kids do not pick up on that. Mirroring somebody's facial expressions. If the one child is crying and upset about something, and you have a friend who walks over and starts laughing, typically that is regarded as an antisocial behavior to engage in. However, I'm aware that many of us in here, especially people who have special education background, will be well aware and know kids for whom that kind of filter or that social knowledge that mirroring the same emotion or a similar emotion to what you're seeing is expected. For kids that lack that knowledge and demonstrate a facial expression that does not mirror that of others, they can easily be socially ostracized or alienated or alienate others through their behaviors and activities, right? So depending on who's in your class, explicit attention to that could matter. If you have young kids and you're talking about group work, I find it completely appropriate to not only address what kinds of comments we make to each other, but also the way we look when we're speaking to each other. The kinds of behaviors that kids read and interpret, to call those out, is again something in primary grades that you kind of have more wiggle room to introduce directly into the classroom tasks and activities. For people who work with older kids, you might have to just look really closely at what it is that your kids need in particular and be very strategic about what you select to work on in terms of social work and cognition with them. As they get older, is that one social skill is to recognize diversity. Yeah. Recognize and accept. So Mindy's point that like kids are going to demonstrate different ways of being, and in life people demonstrate different ways of being, and so using only your lens or your cultural lens of what it looks like to demonstrate respect or joy or disagreement, unpacking that with older kids is really powerful. There's also a huge line of work on teachers and the kind of cultural gap between teachers and the students that they teach, and the ways that social breakdowns occur between the expectations on a teacher's part for how a student will behave in the classroom and the cultural rules that a student may be following. Those, when they clash in the classroom, it can be very damaging to kids and very upsetting. It can be highly frustrating to teachers as well. Eye contact is a really kind of classic example of that, right? So it could be that a child is struggling with making eye contact due to a social difficulty, and that's not at all uncommon for kids that have sensory issues. They get visually overloaded, and that will have crossover with kids that have attentional issues, kids that are on the spectrum disorders, and kids that are just struggling with sensory input and integration. But there's also cultural norms where kids from many backgrounds are discouraged and, in fact, not allowed to look figures of authority directly in the eye. And then they get to school and they're required to look figures of authority directly in the eye. And it's very confusing and upsetting to kids. So there's a social breakdown and then there's cultural mismatch. And those are important to tease out. A lot of the cultural mismatch comes in nonverbal pragmatics. And so kids are picking up on those behaviors, but as teachers, I also always want to caution us to be very well aware of the range of ways of interacting that cultural distinctions represent. Hopefully that makes sense to people. If anyone has questions or comments about that, please jump in or chat them. And then just in terms of verbal pragmatics, it's very similar to what I was talking about with this idea of code switching. So we see some students that are not really able to take up academic talk in the classroom, but they're expected to. And some of that is code switching related, some of that is language related, some of that is knowledge base. But it's really important when we're thinking about expectations for kids in activities to account for what they're being expected to engage in socially as well. And so that's kind of what where those distinctions for me become particularly useful and helpful. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. There's not too many this week. This is what I thought you guys might have some good ideas for. So in terms of the curriculum, it's really useful in my experience to locate these opportunities to emphasize social cognition, right? So especially as kids get older, I really love Mindy's ideas that like recognizing diversity in body language, that's a very appropriate older student activity to engage in. And there's spots in the curriculum that lend themselves quite nicely to featuring social cognition in ways that language is very obviously embedded in a lot of the academic content areas, and memory is implicated in a very obvious way in the academic content areas. Social cognition is often more subtle, but no less important, right? So we've talked about a few of these ideas. So there's like a thematic focus on empathy that could be done through a social skills curriculum, but could also be very nicely embedded in history or social studies or language arts, depending on stories that we're reading. So if we think about these kind of big essential ideas that often accompany units of study, a thematic focus on empathy could be pulled out of a social studies unit that's on developing communities or on expansion of immigration and where people are living, and it's highly relevant for our current day and age, I think, as well. And also could be nicely brought in and woven in a direct way into language arts themes. Right. So Mindy's saying, especially with Common Core, you have to read across cultures, genres, etc. So that idea of comparison that's mostly in those like new history standards for Common Core, right? It's about like comparing documents and sources and understanding multiple perspectives. I know in upper elementary grades, this idea of opinion pieces and perspectives is embedded in argumentation and the writing standards. Those are places to then pull out, okay, so I have a disagreement, or there's two opinions that are opposing here. What is a way to engage the ideas of those opinions and account for the social needs of the person I'm speaking to, and to develop some empathy for those that hold perspectives that contradict my own? That kind of teaching can make a big difference for kids that are struggling socially, that do not pick up on it on their own. And it doesn't often need to take a ton of extra planning and work. It, in my experience, makes itself very obvious what to do with a mindset shift. So attending and observing closely where kids are struggling socially, I have found is like a kind of intuitive, direct connection or correlation to locating those spots in the curriculum to pull out the features that will help the kids that are having trouble. So one way is to use these essential ideas. I'm just going to, well, I'll write it in here just for fun. Essential understandings. You know what I mean by that in the planning, I'm assuming. Okay. And that idea of multiple perspectives includes that too. So that might locate itself in a writing curriculum for argumentation. Okay. And also in Common Core social studies, history social studies. Are there other spots that people are thinking of? Overarching essential questions for units like how do different people tell their stories? Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. Yep. Yep. So those are the ideas. So, and there's also, I don't know how familiar people are with the differentiated KUD. It comes out of the literature on differentiated instruction. There's a KUD planning format, what students are asked to know, understand, and do. That is a nice way to plan units of study. Can I just ask, are people familiar with KUD as the planning tool? I don't think I've spoken with you about it in this course, but you might know anyway. Has anyone heard of that? Mindy has. I ask because I can post a resource for you on that if it's helpful. Right. It's embedded in what's UBD? Is that Universal Design? I don't know. B. UDL. Oh yeah, the backwards planning one. Perfect. Okay. It is Understanding by Design. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I use the UDL language. It's very similar and connected. So if people, I think what I'll do is I'll send you guys out a note. I will post the KUD template on our site. You don't have to use it, but it has some of those examples of what I mean, of essential questions. And those questions I find very useful location to target the particular needs of students in my class, including the social needs. And they will be things like, how do different people tell their stories? And so then we can start to, with that idea, you could start to unpack what are the norms for storytelling, what are the kinds of topics different cultures and people care about and think are important, and how does that compare to what we care about and think is important as individuals and as a kind of collective culture now. So writing for an audience is another place to do it, right? That's right there in the curriculum. Do other people have ideas of other locations in your own classroom or teaching where you might be able to pull out the social aspects of work or the social features to support students developing social thinking and cognition? Okay, well, if you come up with any, let me know. Otherwise, that's what that slide is about and is therefore for you. And then there's just two more, I think. Yeah, there's just two more kind of content slides I want to go over with you quickly. Kagan strategies. What are Kagan strategies, Mindy? I might be the only one who doesn't know that. Oh, thanks, Kate. I'm glad. Okay. Are they protocols? Are there? Oh, for group learning? Really? Oh, I would like those. Would you consider sharing them? How do I get them? Are they free or do you have to buy them? Some of each. If you send me a link or two just to them, I'll share them with the whole group. That would be amazing. Thank you. I'm excited for that because I teach in the master's program at UC Irvine for preparing the new teachers, and a lot of them we're doing inquiry and an inquiry study over these 3 quarters, and a lot of people are working on strategies for grouping and differentiation. So I want to use those. Are they similar to GLAD strategies? I want to know that too. It's cooperative learning. Oh, awesome. I'm so excited about this personally. Kate, do you like GLAD strategies a lot? So I've heard about them, but I don't know them. I never use them. Oh, look at this. Awesome. Okay. Kate, if you want to share your strategies too, if you like them, I will post those onto our page as well. I'll take both of these suggestions and I will give us all access. See, I knew we had more stuff than what was embedded in the literature here. Okay. So I'm going to move us on just for time's sake. So one thing we were talking about so far is like there's social cognition in the content curriculum, right? So that is one location. Thank you, Kate. That is one location where we can place kind of attention to social cognition. Another way to approach supporting positive social interactions and social cognition in the classroom is the learning environment, right, in the classroom, which is a kind of obvious go-to spot for social cognition because the learning environment includes, people's social interactions. So I have found these spots in terms of classroom learning environment to be high leverage. One is in the way, as a teacher, I structure and cultivate and attend to and navigate multi-voice discussions among students. So quite often, students that are struggling with social cognition have a lot of difficulty participating in discussions, and so including some strategies for preparation like we've talked about, like think, pair, share, to get ready for ideas, is one way to navigate those discussions. Another way to support positive interactions, and especially among kids that struggle with social cognition in the classroom, is I have found that there's a tremendous amount of power in getting to know a student who struggles with social cognition, getting to know what that student's relative strengths are and interests, and pull those out to be featured in a multi-voice classroom-based discussion. For example, if I have had a student in the past who had a lot of difficulty with social cognition and also had a fair number of other related learning challenges and language-based learning challenges and some difficulty with expressive language, but was a person who knew a whole lot, and I mean a whole lot, about cars. So what I would do is I would look for opportunities in the curriculum, in a classroom discussion, that for moments that would dovetail on this knowledge base of cars. And so even though that student might not be ready to have a kind of natural and organic back and forth of social ideas exchange with peers, he was able to share what he knew on a particular topic of interest with peers, and so I would give him a chance to do that in a controlled setting. And that would often be in a large group discussion. So like day to day with peers at the lunch table, the same person would try and engage in a long essentially lecture on facts about cars, which would be socially really inappropriate and would violate social norms of how kids tend to interact at the lunch table. But by giving him an opportunity to share what he did know in pursuit of a topic of interest in the classroom, the kid could then be looked at as socially kind of elevated because of his knowledge base. So it flips this idea of knowing more and sharing, like TMI, facts about a particular topic. I created a situation where that was a featured positive thing to do, and that the goal was to kind of mitigate that student's need to express and share those same facts or with as much fervor in more casual social settings. So one thing to do in the classroom as a teacher is to really kind of manipulate and for the purpose of giving opportunities for kids that are struggling socially to be featured in the classroom in a positive way. I found that made a huge difference. I also found that sometimes it would require in the classroom during discussions for me as a teacher not to shut down, but to constrain slightly the participation of people who were socially quite highly skilled and would tend to dominate discussions. Sometimes opening space in a discussion allows kids that have more difficulty a chance to try and fill that space that is often taken up by the kids that show a real social strength. And so I wouldn't want to shut down anyone's social strength, but I would do some amount of, at least internally, explicit thinking about finding those moments to constrain a bit of the dominance of some that tend to be more kind of socially successful and feature those that are less socially successful to create a sense of balance in the classroom and value for everybody's contributions. So that I found really helpful. Social autopsies, which you'll read about this week, is another way to support positive social cognition, and it provides a kind of shared language for kids, resolving conflicts, much like this idea of restorative justice in social autopsies. The notion of giving kids techniques for addressing difficulties that they had in difficult social interactions, and especially techniques that share a common language, can be very very helpful, right? Because for the kids that are socially struggling, hearing the same vocabulary from a teacher about social interactions and having that brought into their interactions with peers can be really crucial for them making those connections between the kind of features of socialization that teachers talk about and what's occurring for them in live time with their peers. Questions or comments about that? Okay, so you all are actual practicing teachers, and I have a feeling that you are aware of, so like I just mentioned, I've been teaching these pre-service teachers, and a lot of what they will, not this exact content, but sometimes they will think something seems like would have a positive contribution to the classroom, but they're worried they don't have time in their curriculum to kind of differentiate or address the particular needs of students. But in my experience as a classroom teacher, and I'm guessing, although you're welcome to disagree with me, in some of your experiences as classroom teachers, the amount of time you save by having kids able to independently resolve conflicts or with some minimal amount of support resolve conflicts, the amount of time spared by having positive and productive discussions versus ones that break down and are filled with arguments far outweighs the amount of additional time it takes to plan for explicit attention to these topics. So in my experience, finding these high leverage moments to address social cognition was something that actually made my classroom run in a much more academically efficient way because these social breakdowns were being avoided. Not entirely, but often more than they would have been. Anyway, feel free to disagree or agree. It's fine too. All right, one more. So the other thing is addressing what positive social interactions look like in a very overt way. So there's like these kind of norms of participation, how to deal with conflicts and breakdowns, and then there's these thematic associations in the curriculum itself. And then there's just flat out, let's model and talk about positive social behaviors. Right. So Mindy's saying, yeah, I agree entirely, and I know we have a lot of primary teachers that are here. Not everybody's primary, but early grade teachers, yes, they can have a shared vocabulary and build on each other's ideas. They just need different versions of kind of training around that. And honestly, older kids that are struggling with it need very similar kinds of supports as well. Young kids can do lots more, I think, than they're often asked to do, or given the chance to. And so one of the things, so this particular slide is something that is often featured in early childhood classrooms and tends to get left behind as kids get older. And I also argue for this being important for older kids as well. And that is positively recognizing your peers. So one way is these are just like kind of visual examples. One is this idea of like put-ups, which kind of coincides with these little hearts here. And I've seen this done in middle school and high school classrooms where they're anonymous. So sometimes kids are asked to spontaneously like write notes to each other and put it in this box. Like, I really appreciated the way you blank. I liked the way, Maggie helped her friend today during group work time. I appreciated the way this person shared with a peer. I appreciated the way this person got over something that was difficult and participated positively. One thing to do is just do these put-ups that kind of introduce and infuse compliments into the day as a way to practice that as being a norm of the classroom. I love the bucket fillers, Alexandra. Yes, my kids do that too. Right, fuzzy ears or compliment. That's right. And they do it. Alexandra, do they do that spontaneously then once they get used to it? Fuzzies, yeah. Yeah, they do. I find even with my own kids who are 6 and 7, with some explicit attention to them being kind to each other, we now hear from others how sweet they are. And in my experience of them, they are sweet kids, but they also are not always super kind to each other. It's taken training on our part, but they really can do it, and it is cute. I agree. Okay, so one thing to do is just explicit, like, let's just say nice things to each other. And I find modeling that is powerful too. So as teachers, something to bear in mind is saying positive things about your colleagues, peers, and others that you know makes its way into the conversations of kids as well. Family histories is a way to get to know each other. I've done this in more early childhood classrooms because it's in the early curricula for social studies, is like family backgrounds, but can be done with older kids as well. And there's something about that kind of cultural recognition of who a person is that really makes the interpretation of individuals' behaviors and ways of participating much, much, much more warmly welcomed by peers. So by learning that in an individual's culture, looking down at the ground when a figure of authority is speaking to you is what you're required to do can really open up new ways of interpreting that person as they participate with peers or interact with teachers. And family histories are a very nice way, in my experience, to kind of get that aired out publicly and in a safe space for them. And then there's the Proud Wall, which is, different people use it different ways. I have used it in my experience where I either with young kids select in the beginning of the year for them what work I think they could be proud of, but I very quickly attempt to transition to kids selecting their own pieces that they would like displayed for others. And that starts to create an environment in the classroom where the messaging to kids is that every individual has something to be proud of, and that every individual deserves recognition for what they're proud of, and they post it up there. And then it connects nicely to this idea of put-ups as well, is that then you can even do a kind of, walk around the room and identify ways that you could compliment each other. I find that some amount of work around that, it doesn't have to take tons of activities. It's a little touchy-feely, I know. But it really is impressive what kids will start spontaneously calling out in a positive way for each other with some practice doing it. And they may or may not have a ton of experience doing that in their home lives, in other classrooms that they've been in. And they typically, there are many classrooms where the messaging is really the opposite, and that there's a sense of humiliation around being incorrect or not being like everybody else. And so as teachers working to support a diversity of ways of engaging with each other, these kinds of activities might look small, but they are highly powerful for interrupting the idea that looking flawless is the only way to be socially and anything else is cause for humiliation. These activities really kind of draw out the range of ways of being that are to be celebrated. So I love them. And if anybody else has other ideas for these kinds of activities, I encourage you to share them with me or with your peers at any point. So, last slide here is just the assignments for this week, which I kind of talked to you about anyway. So there's a discussion forum posted for you, and then there's this reading response to social autopsies, and just go for it. I'm curious what you all will think about Rick Lavoie's ideas about social autopsies, especially because this work around restorative justice and all that kind of stuff has developed since the time he first introduced that idea, and I feel that you'll see a lot of crossover. And other than that, we have one more minute, and then I will let you go, but I now realize once again, this is our last online meeting, so I am sad not to have a chance to talk to you anymore. But I'm here and available to be emailed at any point. I know it's sad. Amy Hanready will be sending you out the link for feedback. I'm not sure when. She and I were just interfacing about that yesterday. And so please fill it out so we can all learn from your experiences and improve our course for future teachers, and even potentially for you in the last in the last module here. You guys are almost there. You're troopers. I really appreciate your work this year. Thank you to everybody. I will be looking at your assignments later in the week, hopefully, and so if you need feedback from me in the shorter run, please just contact me individually. Otherwise, just know that I'm on it, and I will find your work and I will grade it and give you feedback as soon as I am able to do that. And thank you, and I hopefully will get a chance to meet at least some of you someday in person, and otherwise, rock on, teachers. Thanks. I'll see ya. Okay. All right, Zoomers. Bye-bye.